Rick, Jim, thank you very much for having us out. I really appreciate that groups like CFI and Humanist Society of the Suncoast sponsor events like this. When you're an author with a very small publisher, it can be tough to arrange venues. Bookstores are a racket, and so I'm just very fortunate that groups like this will have us out. I want to set this up in historical context. 33 years ago, in May 1982, this town was fed up with some residents who live here. And they had a very famous set of hearings, which featured numerous people talking about the Church of Scientology, but the star of those hearings was Paulette Cooper, and today is the first time she has been back to Clearwater in 33 years. And we thought it was important to have an event here in Clearwater, so close to Scientology's Mecca, because Scientology put her through a lot, and we wanted to tell you about that today. So I'm going to set this up. Paulette Cooper was a magazine writer in Manhattan who thought that this Scientology thing might make for an interesting story, and so she went to investigate it, wrote a magazine story, and the day that magazine story came out, the way she learned that the magazine story came out was that she was phoned by two different men who each told her that if she didn't stop writing about Scientology, they would kill her. And that was the beginning of her harassment. That was in December 1969. And somehow she decided it would be a good idea to then turn that article into a book. Yeah. And that book came out in June 1st, 1971. It was called The Scandal of Scientology. And tell us about some of the things that you went through at that point.
I called the book that launched 1,000 suits because they really came after me right away. In the end, by the time I was finished, they had sued me 19 times all over the world, even for other people's books. That doesn't include, I think, 5. Some of the suits were against the publisher also, who withdrew. They didn't want to fight. And over the years, they just kept harassing me and trying to get me to stop speaking against them. I did speak in Clearwater at the Clearwater, there was a rally in Clearwater, there were 3,000 people, and I spoke there, and then there were Clearwater hearings, and anytime anybody had any problems with Scientology, and a lot of people did, just as this people in this town have had troubles, they would contact me. And I know many people don't believe this, but there was a time that there was no internet. And, really. And somebody had to know what was going on so that other people who were having problems would, say, I'd get a call from a lawyer here. He needed somebody that had a similar problem to his client. I would get a call from a reporter in St. Louis wanting to do a story, but she needed a St. Louis angle, and I would know of a St. Louis person who had been in Scientology. So the Scientologists would then rob the lawyer or the reporter, and they would always find my name there. So that's why they knew what I was doing and wanted to stop me.
Yeah, one of the misconceptions, one of the reasons I got into this project was a lot of myths had built up over the years about this. People would say, Paulette Cooper wrote the first book about Scientology. That's not true. Paulette Cooper was the first critic of Scientology. That's not true. There were other writers at the time. George Malko, for example, came out with a book a year before hers. But the difference was that someone like George Malko would write a very interesting book about Scientology, and then he was done. She wrote a very harsh book about Scientology, and then she went on the television, and then she went on the radio, and then she helped other journalists do stories. And this drove L. Ron Hubbard crazy, particularly because at that time, L. Ron Hubbard was running Scientology from a ship in the ocean. And her book came out in 1971. By 1975, he was tired. He wanted to come back to the US. And in their documents, you can see them specifically talking about how this woman was making that a difficult proposition, and that they wanted to figure out a way to silence her. In fact, Jane Kember, who ran the Guardian's office, noted that she had been sued so many times. She was sued in Toronto and didn't even know it, and had lost. And Jane Kember then talked about using that to compound her problems and silence her before she came to CW. Because that's when they knew they were coming into Clearwater and they did not need her around. Did you know that?
No. I keep learning terrible things that they did. They sent 5 horrible anonymous smear letters about me. One referred to me, one was sent to all 300 tenants in my building in New York, saying that I was a prostitute with venereal disease who had sexually molested a 2-year-old baby girl. And I said to my friend, maybe 22-year-old baby boy, yes, but baby girl. And they sent horrible anonymous smear letters to my parents. I had been dating a guy for a year. They sent one to his boss saying that he was secretly smoking pot to try to get him fired. And there were all these letters, but the apropos what Tony was saying, I didn't even know about some of them. I recently found out, after the book came out, that they had sent an anonymous smear letter to one of my lawyers that had worked for F. Lee Bailey's firm, and he was very good looking. I had a crush on him. I spent all of 30 minutes talking to him. And then sent an anonymous smear letter even to his wife saying they were having an affair. So there were a lot of things I didn't even know about that they were doing all the time.
Yeah, I mean, this another reason why I enjoyed this project a lot, maybe more than Paulette did, was that into things, the more we realized even she didn't know all the harassment she went through. Some of the things we only found out about later, or she didn't understand the extent of it. In 1966, Hubbard really cracked down because there were people leaving Scientology and then doing their own version of it. And that drove him crazy because then the money wasn't flowing through him, see? And so he came up with a control scheme that he very cheekily called ethics. And that was in 65. Then in 66, he actually created Scientology's own spy wing. Now, I don't know how many churches you know have a spy wing, but Scientology has since 1966. They called it the Guardian's Office. Today it's called the Office of Special Affairs. And after her book came out in 71, that Guardian's Office was just totally trained on her. They tried to smear you about your sex life. They tried to ruin your father. They tried to make making a living difficult. And none of that worked. She kept going on TV, she kept going on the radio. And so then there's a Guardian's Office document where one of the operatives said, it's time to get her committed. So what they did was they managed to get your fingerprint on a piece of paper, typed up a bomb threat to themselves, mailed it to themselves, and they called the FBI. When the FBI showed up, they said, who do you think sent this bomb threat? And they said, we think it's a person named Paulette Cooper. And the FBI decided this was a good case and investigated her. And in May 1973, she was indicted and faced 15 years in federal prison and $15,000 in fines. And tell them what you were going through then in the summer of 1973. The trial was scheduled for October 1973. And in those days, not every indictment was made public. So she was living with the fact that at any day, this could become a major news story, that this reporter had threatened to blow up a church, and so far it had been kept secret. So tell us about that time.
Well, I knew that if it ever came out that my career was ruined, everybody I knew was going to read horrible things about me. I felt especially bad because I was a doctor. So the lawyers said that they wanted my parents sitting in the front row of the trial. And I thought how terrible this would be to subject them to it. I seemed to be the only one who knew I was innocent. Everybody seemed to think that I must have sent these because my fingerprint was on one of the bomb threat letters. And getting a fingerprint on a piece of paper is not like a fingerprint on a grand piano. You can move a piece of paper around. You can, as you think happened in this case, a Scientologist got me to sign a petition. She was wearing gloves. This was New York. It was winter. It was cold. And I held the clipboard. And the fingerprint was the third quadrant of my left hand, where I would have been holding that clipboard. And during that time, I went through a very, very difficult time. I mean, the legal expenses just mounted. At the end, it went to $28,000. That would be like paying almost $100,000 today. You've been accused of something that you didn't do, and you're just trying to stay out of jail. And I just could not eat. I stopped eating. I went down to 83 pounds. And I was popping Valium like they were M&Ms, and I was drinking heavily. And just the anxiety was so horrible that at any moment everything was going to collapse. And probably would have been it's sort of New York Post headline scandalous sort of situation. And it was just a very, very bad time.
And it gets worse.
Yeah.
Because the Church of Scientology was not content with simply trying to get her put in prison and encouraging and hoping that she commit suicide. They wanted to know how bad it was for her. So they had, for several months, they had sent spies in to befriend her. And by May 1973, there was a man sharing her apartment, helping her pay rent, who was actually working for the Church of Scientology. So all the things she talked about late at night, about how horrible she was feeling, the things she was sharing with her friends, was all being reported back to the church day after day.
I became very agoraphobic, and one reason I needed somebody had to go out and walk around the Yorkie. And he used to go upstairs to the roof, and there was a payphone up there. I didn't realize the significance of that until years later. But he was a very gutsy guy, and he would jump up, it was 33 stories up, beautiful view of the Empire State Building, small ledge. And he would jump up on there and say, "Come on up, come join me, where's the guts? You're a shell of yourself, you can do it, you can trust me, I'm your best friend." And thank God I was in such a terrible state, I couldn't do it. Because years later, when I found out that he was a Scientologist and I read his diary, which said, "Today she's talking suicide, wouldn't that be wonderful for Scientology?" I realized that he wanted me up there with him, because all he would have had to do is that at that point, and I would have gone over, and everyone would have thought that I committed suicide because I was talking suicide and was so depressed. So I think he was there for a reason other than just to spy on me.
And that was when things looked their worst. I mean, she was considering suicide on her birthday, July 26th. But then things started to get a little bit better. It was fascinating for me to talk to you about how you tried to build a case with your attorneys. Some new information turned up. And ultimately, in September, with a month to go, she took a truth serum test. And the doctor said there's just no way this woman knows anything about those letters and how they were done. Meanwhile, her attorneys had some connections in the prosecutor's office, and they went to them and said, "Look, this is going to be such a terrible trial for you guys. All this harassment's going to come out. The fact that she was offered a deal at one point, she turned it down because she is adamant that she didn't do this, all convinced the prosecutor that this was not a good case, and he postponed it. But she still spent years with this hanging over her head that she'd not been exonerated at that time. But then on July 8, 1977, largest FBI raid in history occurred at Big Blue in Los Angeles, Fifield Manor, which we now call the Hollywood Celebrity Center, in Washington, D.C. And the reason why the FBI was raiding was Scientology had committed the largest infiltration of the U.S. federal government in our history. They had had hundreds of agents breaking into the IRS, Treasury, just all kinds of offices in D.C. and other places around the world. And that's what they were looking for evidence of. They got tipped off. They were looking for evidence of that burglarizing, and they kept running into documents about Paulette Cooper. And that's when they found all of these planning documents, many of which you can read today. Not only had they tried to put her in prison in 1972-73, but then in 1976 they had started an entire, I believe the 76 operation was about trying to keep her away from Clearwater. And it was called Operation Freakout. And in Operation Freakout, they in a very detailed way explained how to get that fingerprint using a clipboard. So we know that's how they did it both times. And they talk about that's what they had done. Well, all this came out, but even then, it took quite a while. I guess it was another year, 78, when the first press came out explaining that she had been the target of all this. But they continued to run operations against you for years.
Right. I found out I was doing some travel writing, and I was coming back from Africa, And I had this terrible secret that I had been indicted and at any moment could explode in the papers. I was up for supposedly sending these bomb threats. And I read that those were the days they used to give free Herald Tribunes on airplanes, international. And I opened up the paper, and there was the headline that said something like, "Seized Scientology papers indicate writer was framed." And there was the whole story.
No.
Oh, I got there were two times of it.
At that time, you just found out they were raided.
Okay.
It was another year before they started talking about you.
Okay, but those times I was on the plane when I read about myself. And the first time I thought, oh my God, it's just a little piece, and it said, 3 Scientology churches raided, and I just started crying. I thought, maybe there'll be something finally in there that proves that I was innocent. And then it was, I guess, a year later that I was coming back
Coming back from Europe.
Coming back from Europe at the time. And there was this huge story with details about the frame-up, which I later found out my code name was Miss Lovely. The last thing they did, no, actually, even up to 2 years ago, I'll tell you about that in a minute, but what they did is they followed my mother's beauty parlor, and they had the Scientologist sit next to her and strike up a conversation. Oh, you have a daughter? I have a son. How old's your daughter? So they were trying to fix me up with another Scientologist. My mother later found out the woman was a Scientologist, which of course she didn't tell her, and she didn't have a son. So they were going to fix me up with another Scientologist if they could. My mother was very shrewd and realized in those days. So.
I started getting these emails from people saying, you know, really like what you're doing, keep doing it. And one of them, the email address said Paulette, and I can't be Paulette Cooper, but it was Paulette Cooper. She was reaching across the country to encourage me. And so we struck up a little correspondence over the years. And then in New York, I became the editor of the Village Voice, and I found out that she was very unhappy that Tom Cruise was going to get a humanitarian award from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And would the Village Voice be interested in printing a statement from Paulette Cooper? I said, of course. And so we printed that, got a huge reaction, and then I started thinking about Paulette more, thinking, you know, I'd really like, I haven't seen a really good story about what she went through. And so I started researching it and realized that what was online was really a mess. There was a lot of mistakes, there were gaps in the record. Several sources, including Wikipedia, said that she'd been born in Auschwitz, which was not true. And so I got together with Paulette and we wrote a story basically about her frame-up. And she came to visit me in New York, and we were just chatting, and she said, yeah, my sister and I were just talking about, we still don't know how we survived the Holocaust. And I was stunned. I know they were very young children, but so that's the first thing we really decided to work together on this project, is let's find out how that happened. And so I just mentioned that in the Voice, that they didn't know. And so several newspapers in the Netherlands and Belgium printed their own stories, and she started to hear from people over there. Tell them what happened next.
Well, my sister and I, we lost our parents in Auschwitz. I was 1 year old. Susie was 2 years older. And because this was in Belgium, Tony's story got picked up by a top Belgian and a Dutch newspaper. And somebody emailed me, and he started asking some questions, and he seemed off the track. I mean, he said, was your father a leather worker? And my father was not a leather worker. But the next day, I called my sister, and I said, wasn't our father, this is our real father we're talking about, wasn't our father a tailor? And she said, yes, but he specialized in leather. And then I realized that this man did know something, and we started corresponding. And it turned out that his father had been friends with my father. There were also three other men. They were all buddies. And they couldn't save my parents when they were taken to Auschwitz. But a year later, they heard that their old buddy, my father, had 2 children that were about to be taken. And we were in a holding camp, a Nazi holding camp. And 1 week short, literally, of the day I was to be sent to Auschwitz, I even have my number and the transport that I was supposed to be on, this man's father and his two buddies raised enough money to bribe one of the very bribable guards in this Nazi camp. And they got us out, and I ended up in orphanages till I was 6 with my sister for a few of those years. And then I was adopted by the Coopers and came to America.
Well, one of our advantages was that the Nazis were amazing bureaucrats, and they kept records of everything. And so we were able to find, for example, the day her father was arrested. In 1942, that early in the war, if you were a Belgian Jew in Antwerp, you would not be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. That came later. In 1942, if you were a foreign Jew in Antwerp, that was enough to get you sent to a concentration camp. And her parents had come from Poland in the 20s. And so her father, Chaim Buchholz, I got the record, he was arrested on July 22nd, 1942. And as soon as I saw that date, my heart sunk. And this was not always an easy process for us. You know, I went to her to tell her that because she was born on July 26th, 1942. And we realized for the very first time that her father had never actually laid eyes on her. Wow. He was sent to a concentration camp, and then a holding camp, and then to Auschwitz. And her mother was arrested 3 months later. But yeah, we found this, there was this notoriously corrupt commandant of the concentration camp there named Philip Schmidt. He was so corrupt, even the Nazis wanted him out of there. And he was removed a couple of months after the girls were saved. But he was there long enough that these families got together, raised enough cash and black market goods to bribe him to allow these two girls out. So that's there, as Paulette said, we have the record of the train she was supposed to be on for Auschwitz. And a month later, we have a record of them in an orphanage. So somewhere in there, this bribe worked. And that's the only reason she's here. She was adopted in 1948 by the Coopers and came to New York. And I often get asked this, why, Scientology was started out as just a magazine story, but it became something that you were passionate about for many years and remain passionate about despite all that they were throwing at you. And you have said it has something to do with your childhood. Why don't you explain that?
Well, those of you who have seen them walking around downtown Clearwater will probably agree with me that this is a very Nazi-looking group. Okay? And thank you. And the behavior and everything is very fascistic. And I just felt that, given my background, that I could not back away from a situation like this.
And so we decided that at that point that there was clearly enough material for a book, and we started working very closely together. But, I got a lot of help from Professor Steve Kent at the University of Alberta, who has the largest collection of Scientology materials in the world. And he found some amazing documents for me. And we kept running into things, operations against her that she didn't even know had happened. But the most surprising was probably one day we were talking, and we were talking about New York, and she mentioned that she still comes to New York, and there's one particular person that she always has lunch with every time she's there. This guy that's been a friend of hers for years, and they talk about various things, but they always talk about Scientology. And she's telling me this story, and she looks to see how my jaw has dropped open. And she says, "What?" And I said, "You didn't hear that he's been outed as a Scientology spy?" And this was a journalist who's worked for Vanity Fair magazine for many years, and Mr. Rinder over here and Mr. Rathbun revealed that he was on the church payroll for many years. And so this was proof to me that the Church of Scientology was keeping tabs on her just up to a couple of years ago.
Wow.
Isn't that incredible? So anyway, there were several things we wanted to do in this project. One was to really get those details about the Holocaust. One was to get all the details about her harassment. But the thing that I really wanted to do was figure out who this guy was, who actually lived with her from May to September 1973. And he called himself Jerry Levin. Tell him a little bit more about Jerry.
He was a very gutsy guy. I mean, just the fact that he would get up on that ledge shows how gutsy he was. And he disappeared at one point I saw the name Jerry Levin in a Scientology publication, and I confronted him with it. And he said, you know, now you've turned on your closest friend, and I was going to help you in the trial and testify as a witness for you, a character witness. And he turned on me, how paranoid could you be? And he disappeared. And I knew nothing further. I began to suspect some things. For example, way in the back of a closet, I had my diary from when I wrote when I was 17, and we all know that there are times that we get mad at our parents, and I wrote, I hate my mother and father, and, you know, underlined it. So of course, somehow or other, my parents received copies of that. So there were some indications of a few things, but I did not want to believe it until I saw these actual documents. But we didn't know who he was. We did know that he called himself Don Alverso.
Well, you knew that he was Jerry Levin.
Right.
And the FBI suspected that Jerry Levin was actually Scientology's #1 spy, was a guy who called himself Don Alverso. And in fact, if you watch Paulette in the 1982 Clearwater hearings, she says that Jerry Levin was Don Alverso. But Don Alverso was a fake name. And apparently the FBI did not know Don Alverso's real name. The Church of Scientology did not know Don Alverso's real name. One of the things I did in this project was I actually approached old Guardian's office operatives, some of whom would talk to me, some of whom told me to go, you know, myself. But the ones who would talk to me all agreed that Jerry Levin had to be Don Alverso, because only Don Alverso was unflappable enough to pull off that kind of an operation. And one person, for example, actually broke into offices of some attorneys with Alverso in 1974, and he was telling me about how he was just petrified as waiting for the police to show up and arrest them, and Alverso just had this big smile on his face. He was just, and he had told them that he had been a combat pilot in Vietnam, so I think that's where just nothing fazed this guy. So who was Don Alverso? Well, here's how we got a break. It was actually pretty late in the game. Karen de la Carriere, former Scientologist, reminded me that when she was married in 1978, Molly Alverso had been one of her bridesmaids. And, another break, Karen knew Molly's actual maiden name. So Karen knows a private investigator, and we asked him to look into this, and he tracked down everything about Molly Alverso. Where she lived, who she'd been married to, and she had been married to the same person all this time. So that's when we realized this must be Don Alverso. But I needed more evidence than that. We then looked around and found a photograph of this guy from 2002. And we showed it to one of the people in the Guardian's office that worked with Don Alverso, and he said, that's him. We have found Don Alverso. But then I showed it to her. And she's like, Tony, this guy's an old fat guy. And I said, I know, you gotta subtract 30 years and 35 pounds and you know, 50 pounds and she said, if I do like this, I said, that's not good enough, that's not good enough. So we knew we had Don Alverso, but we still didn't prove that Don Alverso was Jerry Levin. But then we got another break. A researcher named Virginia McClary was looking around, and she found a photograph of this guy from 1968 when he had just got his wings in the military. And again, the GO people I knew said, again, no question, that is Don Alverso. I showed it to her and she said, hey, it's Jerry Levin. So we're very fortunate. That was literally a month. I was in galleys already, and we were very fortunate. I gave him a call, and it took a while because he works in a family, we're not saying his real name up here, but you can look it up. He works in a family business on Long Island, so very close to me in Manhattan. And it took me several days. He doesn't work every day. And I finally managed to catch him, and I explained that I was writing a book about Paulette Cooper, and I hope enough time has passed that you'd be interested in talking about you know, the Guardian's office. And he said, I'm sorry, what are you working on? Paulette Cooper, Guardian's office, B1, New York org, Scientology. I'm sorry, I don't even know what language you're speaking. I guess you must have the wrong person. So again, I've got like 5 different people who all worked personally with Don Alverso who assure me that this is the correct guy, but they also told me he was unflappable, and he was very unflappable on the phone.
Yeah, last night at a party here in Clearwater, I was talking with a woman who knew him in England. And one of the things that kept driving me crazy is I kept saying to people, I'd say, how tall was Don Alderson? And I'd say, oh, about 5'9". And I'd say, well, that's not him, because he wasn't that much taller than I am. But last night, this woman who worked with him, she said, oh, I don't know. And I'd say she was about 5'5". I said, well, could you look him straight in the eye? Was he about your height? And she said, yes. I said, thank you. So.
No, we have the right person.
Yeah.
We have the right person. But I found that, you know, some people had, it's been enough time that they're ready to talk about it. But even some of the ones that were willing to talk about it still hate Paulette's guts. I mean, I had one Guardian's office guy tell me, okay, she shouldn't have gone through what she went through, but she's not a good person. And he's not, he wouldn't talk to me. And I said, look, I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise, I just need your information. I'm not, you know, I want to hear everything. And that's a key thing about this book. It's not Paulette's memoir. It's my history that I put together speaking to many people, using documents, considering also what Paulette remembered. So we tried to get a more full story about it. And so I am glad that those people cooperated, whatever they think of her. But we still both wished that someone from that day would come forward. And then we got lucky again. Right in the middle of the project, she got an email out of the blue from a guy named Len Zinberg. And what did he tell you?
Well, it turned out that one of Len's jobs was to watch me outside my window or outside my apartment building in New York during the period of time that I never left, so he didn't do too well. That was during the frame-up. But another one of his jobs is that he went and delivered anonymously to my father the pages from the diary that we were talking about. And different people have come forward. For example, I became friendly with someone who lived in Michigan, and his job was to go to every library in Michigan and steal my book, The Scandal of Scientology. And I think it's very apropos that he is now an attorney.
But I want to return to Len, because what was really significant about him, he had also, he admits now, burglarized the apartment of Robert Kaufman, who was another writer at the time. But he came forward because he feels terrible about it. And he apologized to her and said he's been carrying this guilt around all these years. And she finally got to meet him recently, and in New York. And it meant a lot to me to see somebody like that come forward and say, what we did was wrong, what I did was wrong. And he describes the fact that it's been difficult for him to deal with because he went into Scientology with such ideals about, civil rights, and he was Jewish, he had been to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and later to realize what he was doing. And he told me, he said, Tony, I'm not even sure how far I would have gone. If the Guardian's office had asked me to do bodily harm, he says, today, I'm still not sure if I would have or not. So I'm really grateful to Len Zinberg for coming forward and apologizing to Paulette and becoming part of the book. So that's one of my favorite stories from what we did.
Why don't you tell them a little bit about OT3 and OT4? Because some of the people here, I know we have some former Scientologists, but we do have people here who do not really understand what Scientology is.
Paulette likes me to do a little rundown of Scientology beliefs, and I will, in case there are a few people here in Clearwater that don't know what's going on next door to Sandcastle. Well, the thing about OT3 gets way too much attention, thanks to South Park. I actually like OT4 a lot better, and I'll tell you why. If you don't know what we're talking about, Scientology involves levels and courses that you take, and they get more and more expensive. And Claire Headley and I have been through all of them, and she helped me understand the layers of indoctrination that get laid in. Everything good in your life is from Scientology. Everything bad in your life is your own fault. This gets reinforced as the higher and higher you go. And once you go clear, which was originally the ultimate aim, but now it's just an intermediate goal, then things get really weird. And you're paying hundreds of dollars an hour for this counseling. And it's at something called Operating Thetan Level 3, OT3, that you learn this bizarre story that Xenu, the Galactic Overlord, came here 75 million years ago, in an act of genocide and blew up all these aliens at volcanoes with hydrogen bombs. How many people have seen Going Clear, the movie, right? So didn't Alex Gibney do a great job illustrating this? You know, yeah. So you know what I'm talking about, and that today, the result of all that, what you learn on OT3, is that you are actually composed not only of a thetan, which is yourself, is this immortal being that's lived countless lives, but there are hundreds or thousands of other unseen thetans, called body thetans, that are clinging to you, and they're the source of all of your problems, right? You've got arthritis in your elbow, it's because there's a body thetan in there, and you need to drive them away. So you spend all this money on OT3 driving them away. But then you come back for OT4 and find out there's a whole nother set of body thetans there, and they're junkies, right? And it's your job now to drive them all out. I love OT4, right? So not only, and Hubbard anticipates, if you read the materials, Hubbard anticipates that you're going to say, but I'm not a drug abuser. I've never used drugs. It doesn't matter. Your body thetans were totally strung out in other solar systems millions of years ago. And not only were they total junkies, but they were using drugs that we haven't even invented yet. Hubbard says it in the writings. So you're spending thousands of dollars to drive these drunk, coke-addled body thetans away from you, and that's OT4. And Tom Cruise has done it, John Travolta's done it, Kirstie Alley's done it. They don't like to talk about it, but that's what OT4 is.
Tony's just saved you millions of dollars.
Yeah, well, we'd love to hear some questions for you, to answer any questions you might have. We'll do our best to, I'll repeat the questions if I hear any. Yes, back in the back.
Regarding Dianetics and Eleanor Founder, that engrams and implants back then, in 1950, 1950. Well, it turns out that the first clear actually committed suicide by the same staged manifestations as was doing with Paulette. She jumped off a building, which was based weird because she couldn't recall the color of the tie. You're supposed to get a perfect recall, you know, in over all your possessions, policies, and this and that.
Yeah.
And then that was the state clear.
So questions about the first data clear. L. Ron Hubbard published Dianetics on May 9th, 1950, and everything changed for him. It became a huge bestseller. People across the country were trying out Dianetics. Now, Dianetics is not talking about past lives and millions and billions of years ago. In Dianetics, you're supposed to go back into the womb and remember what happened to you when mom and dad were having rough sex. It's a really strange book. You know, when Scientologists come to me and say, oh, I read Dianetics, I thought it was so great, I'm like, I bet you didn't. This book is really strange and hard to get through. But the idea is you're supposed to go back to the womb and remember what some terrible thing dad did to mom, and it ruined your whole life. And then he said up as few as 20 hours of counseling would drive away this negative part of your mind called the reactive mind, and you would become clear. And he made clear sound like kind of a superhuman state. Your IQ would go up, you'd be impervious to disease, and so, wow, that sounds great, I'll do that. And so by August 1950, he had to kind of put up or shut up, and so he had us gathering, help me out, was it the Shrine, or was it the Shrine? Shrine Auditorium, and he produced a young woman, and she used a pseudonym at that time. Her name was Sonia Bianca, right? But that's not her real name. And she was a total failure. I mean, one of the things you're supposed to have is total recall. And so some smart ass in the audience said, "What'd you have for breakfast last Wednesday?" Right? I don't know. Don't look. What's Hubbard's tie? What's the color of it? Utter disaster. Hubbard did not claim to have a clear again until 1966 with a man named John McMaster. Now, I have never heard a story about what ultimately happened to Sonia. This is the first I've ever heard that she committed suicide. I don't know if that's true or not. I know that McMaster had a very difficult time. He was gay, and he was Scientology's ambassador for many years. And all accounts was an absolutely terrific, charismatic, caring man. And he ended up dying penniless in a residence hotel in London, I think, and he had a very, very difficult time. But this is something that I think a lot of reporters ask Scientologists, show us a clear. Show us an operating thetan. Where is this person who's impervious to disease, with perfect recall, whose IQ, And of course the answer we always get, oh, it would be vulgar to use my skills in public.
We have a friend who, she was a Scientologist, and she was having grand mal seizures, and they would not let her use her medication. And every time she'd have a seizure, they would blame her. And they would say that she was invalidating Scientology by having these seizures.
Nice. Another question? Yeah.
I am totally confused how anybody could believe any of this. Can you help me understand? Help me understand how somebody can buy into this.
Yeah, I think that's what Alex Gibney was trying to do with the film Going Clear, is he showed you Paul Haggis, who's a very intelligent, very creative man. Jason Begay, who's a great actor. Mike Rinder, Marty Rathbun. These are very intelligent people. How did they get sucked into this? And I always ask people that. And Scientology is very good at what they call finding your ruin. So for example, a guy named Bruce Hines, he was a physicist, and he got involved in Scientology. Why? He had just been through a terrible breakup. And when Scientology, we first encounter Scientology, we can figure that, we can help you with that. We can always, and it would never appeal to me personally, but what Scientology is selling is certainty. Our lives are confusing, our lives don't make sense. We think if we work hard this way, it'll pay off, and then it doesn't. We have difficult personal relationships, our jobs, we get fired. Life is difficult. Scientology says, follow this check sheet, read this book, and your life will become amazing. That wouldn't work with me. But a certain small section of the population finds that comforting. And remember, they're not told up front what they're really getting into. This was my main beef with Scientology. If Scientology said to you, we can help your life, you're actually infested with unseen aliens, and for $700 or $800 an hour, we'll help you get rid of them, and then recruited people, I would have more respect for them. But instead, up front, they say, we're going to help you with your communication skills, we're going to help you with your confidence, and it just costs a little bit amount of money, come on in. And it's a seductive pitch to certain people. But I hear you. It is difficult for those of us that don't get sucked into it to understand why some other people do. But the more I report on this, the more I meet wonderful, intelligent, creative people who went in for the best intentions, to improve themselves, to improve society, and really had no idea they were getting into this totalitarian organization of ultimate information control that rips apart families, forces young women to have abortions. They just have no idea going in. Now today, they have no excuse. So today it's a little mystifying when I see young people joining Scientology, but some of them still do. Yeah.
I can't help but be struck by the contrast between the FBI's dogged persistence of you, Paulette, and their lack of dogged persistence of people like the guy who hacked you, other people who have reported crimes, reported issues with family members. Do you see anything in the overall picture about any progress the FBI may be making in terms of having the attitude of going in there and doing something?
It's a question about the FBI and their... Well, you saw both sides of it. You saw both sides of it.
Why they went after me the way they did, and when Tony was just hacked, the whole thing, it just wasn't important to them. There was something else, though, going on. This was during the Vietnam era. When I went through Scientology's documents, I saw that Scientology and the FBI seemed to have a very cozy relationship, that people were coming into Scientology in order to be able to get out of the Vietnam War, that they were going to be auditors and so on. If they had trouble with them, it appeared that the Scientology org was giving their names to the FBI. So when the FBI came, when they called the FBI and said, we've received bomb threats, and I only found out this week that they actually evacuated the org and made believe even though they sent it to themselves, they made it seem as if, then the FBI took it seriously and probably wanted to help them. Now, having dealt with Scientology, the government, and that includes the IRS, nobody wants to go through this. They know that it's going to be constant harassment, constant litigation. So it's like, let's do the least amount that we can possibly do and move on. And that's what we're facing, and that's why I don't think the IRS is going to do anything, no matter what, concerning taking away that tax-exempt status.
Could be. Yeah.
Moved here 15 years ago from Connecticut, knew nothing of Scientology, and since then I've been, much to my husband's definitely, reading, investigating. And I live in Palm Harbor, and just as someone in the community, I don't understand, or maybe you can explain, other than fear, intimidation, all these things that we hear and see and read about, why as a community would people, just here alone, let alone around the world, stand up and see that, and speak up, or more people, I should say, as to what's going on. And these aren't bad people, these are good people, decent people, with what's going on. Why do you think that is?
Well, it always drives me a little crazy when I see the latest magazine story. It always has the word inside Scientology, secrets of Scientology. I'm in the business of trying to find more secrets to reveal to folks, but most of this has been known since about 1968 or something. The basic structure of Scientology, what it does, what its controversies are, was thoroughly investigated by the state of Victoria in Australia in the mid-60s, by the United Kingdom in 1969. I don't know many organizations that would have survived what the US government put Scientology through in 1977 to 1980, with that major raid, sending 11 top officials to prison. Scientology is tenacious, and they fight back. And one of the, for example, I really enjoyed reading about Snow White because that was happening while her story was going on. And what I didn't realize until I started digging into it was the raid happened in July '77, and immediately Scientology was suing over it and saying, your affidavit was faulty, your search warrant was faulty, we want our records back. And the FBI and the Justice Department were told, you can't do anything publicly with this information as long as it's being litigated. And so Scientology got a head start. They put together these binders with 50 years worth of, 25 years worth of clippings that were all sympathetic to them, and sent it out to every columnist in America. And several columnists used it. I found a conservative columnist that wrote a column saying, why is the government picking on Scientology? I found a liberal columnist that said the same thing. Scientology won the PR war because the government had its hand tied behind its back for quite a while. By the time they finally prosecuted Mary Sue Hubbard and the others in 1979, and then she went to prison in 1983, that's way back in the back of the newspaper. It just wasn't an issue anymore. So Scientology has managed to weather these things because they have a lot of money, and they don't spend it on their own people, they spend it on attorneys, private investigators,
Buildings.
and these days on buildings. And so they weathered that. You have to give them credit. Most organizations like this would not survive the death of the founder. And yet now we're 29 years since L. Ron Hubbard died, and David Miscavige is still running this thing. I think they're in trouble. I think they're dwindling. But yeah, I think Paulette's right. I think the IRS and the FBI know. In fact, I think it was Mike Rinder that told me, think about this, if you're a government official and you're thinking about, I'm going to go do something about that Scientology organization. We're going to prosecute them, investigate them. He said, you have to make a calculation in your mind. You have to decide that this is going to be the rest of your career, because that's all you're going to be doing. And so, I don't know many government officials that want to do that. So I understand what you're saying. It's well known what they do. It's well documented. It doesn't change. They were wiretapping her in the 70s. They hacked me 2 years ago. This is how they operate. And L. Ron Hubbard died. He can't come back and rewrite the rules. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, it's a question for Paulette. I want to say that I appreciate your tenacity in all this throughout the years. It's amazing. And my question is, what was the very first contact, the very first information, or maybe it was somebody that you knew or met, what was the first information you ever got about Scientology before you met them?
When I was 15, I read a book by Martin Gardner. Some of you know who he is, right? Called Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science, and it was about Dianetics. And I laughed my head off, didn't think anything further. And then I became a copywriter at BBDO, and I met somebody who had joined Scientology. In fact, he's my boyfriend. And then he told me that he thought he was Jesus Christ. And I went to his boss, who was also my boss, you know, and higher up, who'd gotten him in. And I said, he thinks he's Christ since you got him to join Scientology. And he said, well, maybe he really is. So at that point, I thought, I'd like to look further into this.
And that was when she left advertising and started writing a magazine. So that's what. And so she signed up for the communication course at the New York Org, which at that time was in the Hotel Martinique. She took that course over the weekend.
I've heard that they used intimidation and lawsuits against IRS officials to actually get their tax exempt status.
Oh yeah, and that's one thing that Alex left out. I don't know if I forgot to say it or if it got edited out, but in the movie Going Clear, I'm one of the people that talks about the way they got their tax exempt status. I had actually interviewed the previous IRS commissioner, who was the IRS commissioner under Reagan, I think. And the IRS was, you know, I'm quoted in the movie saying there were all these lawsuits. It wasn't just the lawsuits. These individual IRS officials were followed, bugged, harassed. They, you know, Scientology would find, you know, some IRS official has a couple of rental properties. They would go to the renters and encourage them to file code violations just to make the guy's life miserable. And they knew where it was coming from. This IRS commissioner told me, he said, Tony, 2 calls at 2 o'clock in the morning. My office was bugged, lawsuits. All, you know, you knew this was never going to stop. And he said, but you know what? I wasn't going to back down. But the next guy didn't feel that way. In October 1991, Marty Rathbun and David Miscavige showed up unannounced at the office of the IRS commissioner. And I want to carefully note, it was Fred Goldberg, who was the IRS commissioner for George Herbert Walker Bush, okay, 1991. And they had a meeting, and the way Marty describes it is, they were talking about, you know, isn't it time we just got through all this and have a settlement, figure things out? And Goldberg at some point said, so all these lawsuits and all this, it would end? And Marty said, overnight. And he said the guy's shoulders just sort of slumped. And right after that meeting, Fred Goldberg ordered a commission that would study the tax-exempt status of Church Scientology. I have been told by tax experts that once he did that, done deal. Now it took 2 more years for this process to go through all the hoops and stuff. And so it was actually in 1993, under President Clinton, that it was signed. But I think there's equal blame between both Bush and Clinton. Some people want to blame Clinton, but no, it really started. And they got everything. They got everything. And the previous IRS commissioner made it very clear. The courts had always been on the IRS's side. Repeatedly, the church had sued the IRS, gone into court, and the court had said, it's obviously a business that benefits the top people. That's not a church. And so the IRS always had the courts on their side. They just simply caved. They couldn't handle the pressure anymore. So they've had tax-exempt status since 1993. Instead of $1 billion tax bill, they paid $12 million. And they've had to pay no taxes since then. They pay their workers 20, 30 cents an hour. And they have, you know, very wealthy people giving them tens of millions of dollars. You add all that up, and today they've just got mountains of cash. Estimates something like $3 billion in assets and liquid cash. Yeah.
I heard that in 1967, L1 Henry had tax exemption for his churches.
Out to the reference post, please. Out to the reference post, please.
Which is the reason why the state of Florida actually isn't giving Medicaid to people, because there is this thing called Dianetics, the law that cites mental health. You can get better by doing this.
It's actually the other way around. It was 1967 when it lost tax-exempt status.
Yeah, but since Dianetics was written in 1950 about the engrams, you know, like it is engrams, it's a word that causes,
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with Florida or taxes. I'm assured. Yes, sir.
Basically, there's usually an upstanding attorney someplace where there's a Giuliani involved, where there's Greek now. There's nobody who's not tied to anything.
What do you think? The question is, why hasn't somebody come forward, some champion like a Giuliani or some government official, and said, I'm going to make this happen? What do you think? Take on Scientology, take on tax exemption, prosecute for trafficking.
You explained it. The rest of their life would be ruined. And even if somebody doesn't have something to hide themselves, very often they have a family member and they don't want to risk the family member being harassed. So it's...
Yeah.
This is an old story, I don't know if you've heard it before though, but it's 78, I believe it's 78. The courts throughout Florida's laws governing the licensure of psychologists, counselors, and social workers, because they were drafted in such a way that they excluded Scientology auditors. The legislature had to write a completely new set of laws very quickly and get them passed that spelled out what you have to do to be a psychologist. I'm a social worker, a counselor or a social worker in Florida, and they had to be written so that they didn't automatically exclude a Scientology practitioner if he or she wants to get a degree in psychology and go through all the steps of serving an internship in public employment. But for about 8 months, we had no licensure laws in Florida for the helping profession.
I don't know that history. I don't know at all. Yeah.
It's true.
Interesting.
What do you think is their Achilles heel? We live in the world of the internet. Obviously, it's widely exposed. Movies come out, your books are coming out, your website is so popular. What, if you can, I don't want to predict.
No, I think the internet's been devastating for Scientology. I think they're having a real hard time recruiting people. I personally, I think the internet's been difficult on religion in general, but particularly on Scientology. Scientology's now dwindling, and as far as its Achilles heel, I think the fact that it's become the butt of so many jokes makes it very difficult for them, and they don't handle it very well. And I mean, you can see the way they do, you know, their answer to all this is just to put out more advertising on television. It just doesn't work. So I guess their Achilles heel is L. Ron Hubbard, and his words cannot be changed, and they have to keep following it, and they will follow it right into the ground. Yeah?
You said the magic word for me, church. The Church of Scientology is so much bunk. It defies every historical definition of what a church is. And that gives the whole church a bad name. Is there any way those two words can be removed?
You know,
No.
you know, it's interesting to look at the history of it. Keep in mind that in 1950, Hubbard published a book called Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, and he claimed it to be a science. And if you talk to longtime Scientologists, they will tell you that one of the things that appealed to them was that it was an exact science that helped them understand their past and things like that. In 1953, after a fantastic first year, things went in the toilet for Hubbard. He was bankrupt, went through a difficult divorce, starting to build things back up. He even lost the use of the word Dianetics, which is why he came up with this new thing called Scientology. And the main difference between the two was that Dianetics, you have to go back to the womb to remember what traumatic memories you had. Scientology, you go way back. Previous lives, millions and billions of years. But even then, he was having a hard time. There were only a few people, and he actually says in a letter to one of his followers, we couldn't really get any worse right now, let's try the religion angle. He literally uses those words. And so in December 1953, he and his son and their wives in Camden, New Jersey, filed paperwork to create the Church of Scientology, the Church of, no, this is before CST. It was Church of Religious Engineering, I think it was, and one other one, some bizarre names. And that's the first Church of Scientology. Now, a few months later, in February 1954, one of his followers started the Church of Scientology in California, and most press will say the Church of Scientology started in 1954. No, it started in December 1953. And he used that word church because it had a Christian connotation, right? But it wasn't until the 60s that he really asked people to start wearing priest collars and wearing crosses. So I think most long-time Scientologists will agree with you that it's pretty cynical. It's a show for tax reasons. But then I've met Scientologists that will very angrily say to me, you're picking on my religion. Leave my church alone. They use those words. And then you get into the argument, okay, so what is a church? What is a religion? And I hate that whole discussion. I just care about what they do as an organization and the practices and the abuses And I'll let the internet forums argue about what's a church and what's a religion, what's not. I don't, you know. The most important thing about the fact that they do have tax exempt status, as Larry Wright explained in the film, is it gives them enormous protections in court. And that, I think, if the IRS would be so easy for the IRS to remove that tax exempt status now. Because just a few months ago, they were caught, for example, paying 2 private investigators $10,000 a week for David Miscavige to follow his own father, who had left Scientology. Now, I would like the IRS to ask the Church of Scientology, explain to us how $10,000 a week for a couple of private eyes with an arsenal to follow a man is tax-exempt money for a religious purpose. Wouldn't that be fun? So we'll see if that happens. Okay, so we're going to sign some books, and you can ask us some more questions. I don't know how long we have the room, but it's getting warm in here. And so we're going to sign some books, and thank you so much for welcoming us here. And thank you so much for welcoming us here. And wave hello to them as you go by their place.